Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your time. Let me first talk about peace process. Is the EU following the current peace talks between the Taliban and Afghan government? What is your assessment of this process?
Yes, of course, we are following very closely the negotiations in Doha. We are not present in Doha because that is just a few countries of the core supporting group. And we want this process to be a truly Afghan-owned and Afghan-led process, as everybody has repeated many times. But the fact that the two parties are discussing together without any foreigners in the room is for us very important, and we believe that there should be as little influence of foreigners as possible. So the less there is people around the negotiating room for us, the better. And this is the reason why we are not present in Doha for the time being. But we, of course, follow very closely through different channels what is happening. And we still believe that the process, despite all the difficulties, which I think we will discuss, is an opportunity. That it should be maximized, that it should be continued, but of course that should not be the case at any cost, and that we need to calibrate the process in the right way.
But do you see any progresses in the peace negotiation in Doha? If not, what are the main challenges of the peace negotiations?
I think the main challenges of the negotiation are, let me mention a few. The number one is clearly the violence. This is not in the room, but it is giving a very negative flavor and taste to the negotiations in the room. The levels of violence that exist today, both quantitatively but also qualitatively, with horrible attacks, is clearly having an impact on what is needed in a negotiation around the negotiating table, and that is trust. There can't be trust in Doha when we see what is happening in Afghanistan. So to the EU, and I know that a very wide and large part of the international community believes and in the same way, the violence is a real spoiler of the negotiations. So those who are carrying out this violence must know that they are actually going against not only the letter, but also the spirit of these negotiations. That's one. The second challenge, I think, is the lack of compromises. We have seen an unbalanced process so far, with many concessions and compromises being made by the Republic and very little compromises or concessions, if any, being made by the Taliban. This is not a negotiation. A negotiation is a dialogue where both parties accept not only to listen to the other party, but also to get closer to the positions of the other party. So I think this discrepancy and this incompatibility between what a negotiation is all about and what it is in actual terms, with a very unbalanced process so far, even with more demands of the Taliban when it comes to further releases of prisoners, lifting of UN sanctions and so on. I think there needs to be a rebalance and a recalibration of the negotiations to give it the right spirit, because only with the right spirit you will achieve a peace that is lasting and sustainable. Otherwise, the peace will not last.
Violence and targeted assassination of journalists are increased in Afghanistan. What is the EU stand, at least to decrease the level of the violence?
Well, the EU, I think, has been loud and very clear on condemning in the strongest possible terms what is clearly an organized, masterminded, orchestrated wave of targeted assassinations of journalists, of human rights defenders, of moderate intellectual, moderate Islamic scholars, officials, women, promising young people, and so on and so forth. So I repeat here the strongest possible condemnation of the EU to these targeted attacks on the modern people of Afghanistan. you know, when people kill before getting to power, they usually continue killing after being in power. And this is a very bad omen. So we would like to see more. We would like to see this, of course, stopping, but we would also like to see a very clear, without any ambiguity, condemnation of these killings by the Taliban, by the neighboring countries, and of course by the whole Muslim world. And we have seen that the OIC has spoken on this, and this is very much welcome. So it is clearly a movement that is made to influence people and to try to evacuate and prepare the ground for seizing power in conditions that will be more fit for the Taliban to take over power. This is totally unacceptable. We will not accept it, and we are thinking about, I can't dwell on this now, but we are thinking about measures that will be taken.
What has the EU done so far to convince the Taliban to accept the ceasefire, or at least to reduce the violence?
Well, we have in our public messaging, and you know, we speak our minds, we have been I think also very consistent, coherent in our public statements and messaging to tell the Taliban and the government sometimes what we think and what is the best way ahead. So the EU has been at one of the first with the UN to call for an immediate, comprehensive and nationwide ceasefire, for instance. And I'm very happy to see that now you have a movement on the ceasefire that is much bigger, that has been rallied by many, many countries and organizations. And again, I mentioned the OIC that 1 or 2 days ago has made a very strong appeal to the whole Muslim world, to the 2 billion Muslims, by its own organization, for an immediate, comprehensive and nationwide ceasefire. So we're happy to see that the UN call by the Secretary General has been heard. It has been relayed by the whole world through the UN General Assembly, through the UN Security Council, and I hope the EU has modestly contributed to this.
During this process, you met Mr. Khalilzad and Mullah Brother. Has there been any changes in the Taliban behavior and attitude?
Look, if you compare the behavior with the long-term past, one change is that there is now a formal dialogue, and I think that is welcome. It is good, and I appreciate that, you know, the Taliban are sitting around the table and are willing to discuss. This is good, and it should continue. But again, it should be a real negotiation. It should not be a place where talks are ongoing, and while on the ground there are actions of terrorism, of military operations that are being carried out and that are in total contradiction with the letter of the Doha Agreement, but also the spirit of the Doha Agreement. You know, I see very often the Taliban regretting the fact that the Afghan National and Defense Forces are carrying out attacks. Well, if there was a ceasefire, all these attacks would not take place. So if the Taliban would like to stop civilian casualties and they would like to stop military countervailing attacks by the Afghan forces, it's very easy. They just have to agree on a ceasefire. And then nobody would die anymore, neither in the Taliban areas nor in the government-controlled areas. So yes, you see a little change on the form, for example, because there is a negotiation, but we still need to see the real change on the substance.
But the dialogue forward step by step with increasing of the violence. You mentioned that Taliban doing terrorist action. For EU, Taliban is a terrorist group or a political group?
Well, the Taliban is still formally on the UN sanctions list and on the US sanctions list. So formally speaking, this is still a terrorist group. We hope that one day the Taliban will change behavior and will be able to become a political group and will transform violence into political struggle. This is normal. to have a political struggle. But it is not normal to continue killing fellow Afghans just because they have different opinions.
And for now, Taliban is emphasizing to release Taliban prisoners, but released Taliban prisoners are part of the violence. Was the EU aware of the released 5,000 Taliban prisoners, including the European killers?
No, we were not aware. That came as a surprise. When the Doha agreement was announced, we were not aware that 5,500 prisoners had to be released. I mean, 5,000, but it happened to be more than that. This came as a surprise to us, and we did not agree with this. So you can imagine that we do not agree either with further releases under the levels of violence for the time.
In an interview on June 24th, you mentioned that withdraw city ceasefire and intro-Afghan dialogue are 4 chapters of the package in peace process. Is needed to follow these chapters in the same time together?
Look, first of all, I don't think there was 4 chapters. I think there were 5 chapters because, as you correctly mentioned, there was the issue of the release of prisoners, which was even a precondition for the 4 chapters to actually start and be materialized. So we still believe that the right way is, number one, to have a package approach. That means that the Doha agreement will be considered as fulfilled only when the 4 elements, apart from the release of prisoners, will be fulfilled. And as you know, the withdrawal of troops has started in a very quantitatively in a very strong way, with many thousands of US troops having left. The intra-Afghan negotiations have started, so this is good. But when it comes to the guarantees on counterterrorism, I hear even from the Americans that they are not happy with the guarantees they have received, and they are not happy with the information that comes from the ground on the delinking of the Taliban movement with other terrorist groups. So I think the package approach should be continued. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And also very important, the Doha agreement has always been presented by the US administration as being conditions-based. And we hope that these conditions will be applied more strictly by the new administration, because this is very much needed for the credibility of this agreement.
But which one is the priority from these 5 chapters that you mentioned?
Well, as I said, if you ask me as a European, I would say that the 2 priorities now are to continue the Doha talks, the dialogue, the discussions, the negotiations, and the second one is an immediate ceasefire. The ceasefire should not be the smallest and the weakest of the 4 chapters. And it seems that the Taliban are not, paying a lot of attention or a lot of interest to this particular chapter. They believe that this should come at the very end of the negotiations in the final agreement, but this may take a very long time. It may take months, maybe years. So what we want is that the ceasefire is not the result of the negotiations, but it accompanies the negotiations as from now.
The preserving of the last year's achievement of the vital request of Afghan people, will the EU use their diplomacy on this point?
Yes, of course. We have been, I think, with our European member states and also with our allies, the EU has been very strong in calling for protection of the Republican values, of the democratic efforts that have been made over the last 2 decades. Still imperfect, but a lot of work has been done nevertheless under extremely challenging circumstances. So the EU is firmly of the opinion that the achievements of the last 2 decades should be not only be protected, but should also be promoted further. All the opinion polls that I read in Afghanistan are showing extremely clearly that a vast majority of the population wants to continue living in an Afghanistan that is democratic, free, where women have their rights, where youth can prosper, and where different opinions, different religions can actually be carried. So we will continue the work, and this is why with our international partners, the US, the UK, Japan, Australia, Canada, we have all agreed on a document which is called the Key Principles for the Future Support to Peace and Development to Afghanistan, where decades of improvements and achievements are not protected. This will have an impact on our cooperation with the future power.
But if peace leads to the creation of an Islamic Emirate, will the EU continue their cooperation in supporting Afghanistan?
Look, I encourage you to read the political orientations that the 27 foreign ministers of the EU have adopted on the 29th of May last year, 29th of May 2020. It is a short document. I encourage you to read it. And the 27 foreign ministers all together, unanimously and jointly, have said very clearly that the EU will not accept an Islamic Emirate. So if Afghanistan decides to re-establish an Islamic Emirate of the likes that we have seen in the late 90s, this will have a major impact on our relationships with the future Afghan power. And I have to say that this position is not only a European position, but it has been adopted in such strong terms in the UN Security Council, where a resolution has clearly said that they will not accept an Islamic Emirate.
And how about a provisional government if Taliban and Afghan government negotiating team agreed on peace process?
Look, it is for the Afghans to decide on their system of governance. It is not for foreigners to either trigger or promote or push any kind of government or interim government or transitional government in Afghanistan. I think this should be led to Afghans, and we have no rights as foreigners to maneuver behind the scenes to try to push for an interim government. If the Afghans altogether decide that this is the best form for the way ahead, fine. But what I want to say is that for the time being, it seems to me that the discussions on an interim government are mainly justified and based on a willingness by some to change the power in Afghanistan and to get to power themselves. So I don't see a lot of intentions to bring peace and unity and inclusivity in these discussions. So whatever the Afghans decide, and it should be made in order to promote peace, to get a step closer to peace, to stability, and certainly not to weaken the republic and to weaken the constitutional order. I think we have to be extremely careful on what we do with alternative forms of governance outside the constitution.
Any decision on governments in Afghanistan should be made by the Afghan people. That is part of your tweet on Twitter. Is provisional government is a foreigner request in peace process?
I don't know from whom this request comes first, but what I know is that some foreigners, but also some politicians in Kabul are discussing about this. So again, it should be a decision made in an inclusive way between the Afghan politicians, not a way to exclude anyone. And it should be made for peace and stability and not just to change power and use the current difficult situation in order to change the governance.
And you're optimistic that these talks will end the war in Afghanistan?
For the time being, it is you need to be optimistic, but it is difficult to see the light at the end of the tunnel for the time being. I think we have just entered the tunnel and we don't see the light. We will start seeing the light when we will see the two parties willing to show genuine commitment to peace with real, concrete manifestations of their willingness to make a step towards the other party, to give their hand to the other party. And when all that will be translated on the ground, without the levels of violence, without the level of extremely brutal assassinations that we see now, then we will start to see the light. For the time being, we still don't.
At the first of interview, you mentioned about the lack of compromise between the two sides. Do you see a national and regional consensus in the peace talks?
I think the regional consensus is extremely important. As much as we promote an Afghan-owned and Afghan-led process, and we are genuine in this, we should not be naive, and we know that the neighbors of Afghanistan can have, I hope, some positive influence on the process, and so does more remote countries as well, further around out of Afghanistan. So the international community has a duty, has a responsibility to help Afghanistan and not to create further problems. And in order to help Afghanistan, we need to, number one, leave the process to the Afghans themselves and intervene and interfere as little as possible, number one. And number two, the international community needs to do its own homework. We are very often asking a lot from the Afghans, but we should ask a lot of things from ourselves as well. We should do our homework. And the international community, to do its homework, should be more united around the common challenges that we see and the common concerns that we have on terrorism, on narcotics, on traffickings, on radical ideologies, and so on and so forth. And I think on this there is a very wide consensus on which we can all agree. And we should also be more disciplined also in terms of implementing the political orientations that we adopt at very high level at the UN, in Geneva, in different joint statements that we agree on at ministerial or heads of states level. I think we should be very disciplined, and it's only with unity, discipline and coherence in our positions and messaging, both private and public, that we will have a positive impact on Afghanistan.
Mr. Ambassador, U.S. have decreased the level of the forces to 2,500 and will be zero on the May of this year. Will the EU withdraw with U.S. forces on May?
Look, this is for the member states of the European Union to decide. The EU itself is not a member of NATO. Our member states are members: Germany, Italy, Romania, and so on and so forth. So we have about 23 contributing nations to NATO and to the Resolute Support Mission. So this is for our member states to decide. And at the next NAC in Brussels very soon, these issues will be discussed with the new incoming administration of the US. And I think this will be an important moment to reassess the situation and to see what will be done in the future on the basis of Doha, but maybe also on the basis of how to improve the conditions-based approach and how to improve the balance in the situation now.
And will the EU continuing supporting Afghanistan after peace talks?
The EU will always support the Afghan people. When it comes to supporting the power in Afghanistan, that will depend on the power. As I said before, the EU is, without any ambiguity, supporting a Republican, democratic and free regime in South Asia. It is key first for the Afghans, but it's also key for the allies. So we will have to assess our future support on the basis of the conditionalities that we have enacted with our partners, not only European, but also non-European partners, as I mentioned before. And I think this conditional approach will be key. We have been very clear, we have been very transparent with the Taliban that we will not be able to support any kind of regime. So if the Taliban are interested in normalizing relationships in the future with us, in having normal and constructive relations, in accessing the money of the European Union, which is the first donor in the world, both for development and humanitarian aid. If they want all that, the situation will need to dramatically change.
In at all, the EU supporting centralized system in Afghanistan or decentralized in Afghanistan? Recently, the Foreign Relations and Defence Committee of British Parliament stressed on this centralized system in Afghanistan.
Look, this is something that needs to be the object of a very deep and comprehensive discussion. And this discussion needs to be carried out first by the Afghans. It is for the Afghans together, through their own systems of political dialogue and consultation, through the jirgas, through the different ways of bringing the different regions, the different ethnic groups, the different religious groups, the different age groups, women and men around the table and discuss about what they think is the best way forward for Afghanistan. What we want or what we desire as foreigners for Afghanistan is a peaceful, stable and secure Afghanistan that is able to be at peace with itself and would have the capacity, the willingness and the knowledge of their own country that will enable them to find the best way to rule themselves and the best way to have a system of governance and a system of constitutional order that will enable them to be in peace with each other.
For the last questions, European countries began deporting Afghan refugees. Do you not think that you have endangered their lives while even the people in Kabul are not safe?
This is not a new decision. This is the issue of irregular migration, returns and readmission is an issue on which we have been working for many years with Afghanistan. And there have been agreements that have been made between the two parties, Afghanistan and the EU. And we just try under very difficult circumstances. And I agree that Afghanistan is a difficult place to implement these issues. But we are trying to find a human and the right balance between that caters for the security of those who are irregular migrants.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, for your opportunity.